Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. It's been years since that fateful hiking trip in Sequoia National Park, but the memories still haunt me. I've spent countless nights trying to make sense of what I saw, what I experienced. Even now, as I sit down to write this account, my hands tremble slightly and a chill runs down my spine. But I need to share this story, if only to unburden myself of its weight. My name is your name, and I've always considered myself an experienced hiker. I'm the type who craves long expeditions on remote trails, far from the beaten path. The solitude, the challenge, the raw beauty of nature, these are the things that have always called to me. I've faced my share of dangers in the wilderness, encounters with wildlife, treacherous terrain, and even getting lost for brief periods. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of Sequoia National Park. It was late summer when I set out on what was supposed to be a 10-day backcountry trek. I had meticulously planned the route, obtained the necessary permits, and packed all the gear I'd need for an extended stay in the wilderness. The trail I chose was barely used, winding through the southern part of the park, along steep ridges and into deep, secluded ravines. I craved the isolation, the sense of being truly alone in the vastness of nature. Looking back, I realize how foolish that desire was. The morning of my departure, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the weight of my pack on my shoulders, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the scent of pine and earth in the air. It all filled me with a sense of purpose and excitement. As I signed in at the trailhead and took those first steps into the forest, I had no idea that this journey would change my life forever. The initial days of the hike were everything I had hoped for. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and just enough of a breeze to keep the mosquitoes at bay. The scenery was breathtaking. Massive sequoias towered above me, their reddish-brown trunks stretching impossibly high into the canopy. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the branches, dappling the forest floor with patterns of light and shadow. I made good progress those first few days, covering more ground than I had initially planned. The solitude was profound. Save for the occasional chipmunk or bird, I encountered no other living creatures. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. At night, I'd make camp in small clearings, always following proper backcountry protocols. I'd secure my food in a bear canister, set up my tent, and enjoy a simple meal while watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Those early evenings were peaceful, filled with a sense of contentment and oneness with nature. But on the fourth night, something changed. I had made camp earlier than usual that day, finding a perfect spot near a small stream. The babbling of the water provided a soothing backdrop as I went about my usual routine. As darkness fell, I built a small fire, more for comfort than necessity. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, creating an almost hypnotic dance of light and dark. It was well past midnight when I first heard it. At first, it was so subtle that I wasn't sure if I had heard anything at all. A rustle in the underbrush, perhaps, or the snap of a branch. In the wilderness, such sounds are commonplace, usually indicating the presence of small nocturnal animals. But this was different. There was a weight to the sound, a deliberateness that sent a shiver down my spine. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining my ears. For several long moments, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it again, a heavy footstep, followed by another. Whatever was out there, it was big. My mind immediately went to bears, the most likely large predator in the area. I ran through the mental checklist. Food secured? Check. Fire still burning? Check. Bear spray within reach? Check. But as I listened, a creeping sense of unease began to grow. The footsteps, if that's what they were, didn't sound quite right for a bear. They were too irregular, almost awkward, as if whatever was making them was struggling to move quietly. And they seemed to be circling my campsite, never coming closer but never moving away. I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" The sounds immediately ceased. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning I awoke with the sun, feeling groggy and unsettled. Part of me wanted to dismiss the night's events as nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by isolation, but as I began to break camp I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tracks. Large, misshapen tracks in the soft earth around my campsite. I've seen plenty of animal tracks in my years of hiking, deer, bear, mountain lion, but these were like nothing I'd ever encountered. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print. The shape was vaguely human-like, but distorted, with elongated toes and what looked like claw marks at the tips. And the gait was all wrong, too wide and uneven for any animal I knew of. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Someone, or something, had been watching me during the night. And whatever it wasn't natural. My first instinct was to pack up and head back the way I'd come. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. But a mix of curiosity, stubborn pride, and perhaps a touch of denial made me reconsider. I'd planned this trip for months, and I wasn't about to let some unidentified animal scare me off. Besides, I reasoned, if it had wanted to harm me, it had ample opportunity during the night. So, against my better judgment, I decided to continue on my planned route. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. As I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see something watching me from the shadows of the forest. Little did I know this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the very limits of my sanity and survival. The fifth day of my hike dawned bright and clear, but the beauty of the forest was lost on me. My nerves were frayed from a night of fitful sleep, plagued by vivid nightmares of being chased through endless woods by a shapeless, growling entity. I broke camp early, eager to put some distance between myself and the site of the previous night's unsettling events. As I hiked, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was just a bear with an unusual gait. Maybe the tracks had been distorted by the soft ground. But no matter how I tried to explain it away, a nagging doubt persisted in the back of my mind. The trail became more challenging as the day wore on, winding up steep inclines and along narrow ridges. Under normal circumstances, I would have reveled in the physical exertion and the breathtaking views. But now every step felt like a struggle. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My pace quickened without me consciously deciding to speed up. I found myself constantly scanning my surroundings, jumping at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. Shadows seemed to move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I decided to take a break, finding a small clearing with a fallen log that made for a perfect resting spot. As I sat down and took a long drink from my water bottle, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself. "There's nothing out here but trees and wildlife. Get a grip." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Something had fundamentally shifted in my perception of the forest around me. The silence, which I had once found peaceful, now seemed pregnant with menace. The trees, majestic and awe-inspiring before, now loomed over me like silent sentinels, hiding untold dangers in their shadows. As I sat there, trying to gather my wits, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart, but it grew clearer, unmistakable. Whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on the breeze that rustled through the leaves. I couldn't make out words, just a sibilant hissing that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I sprang to my feet, spinning around trying to locate the source of the sound. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "Show yourself." The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving only the echo of my own voice. But the silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt expectant, as if the entire forest was waiting for something to happen. I didn't wait to find out what. Grabbing my pack, I practically ran down the trail, all thoughts of rest forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was I losing my mind? Had the isolation gotten to me so quickly? Or was there really something out there, something that defied explanation? As the day wore on and the light began to fade, my fear only grew. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking presence. Every natural sound of the forest became sinister in my paranoid state. I knew I should stop and make camp, but the thought of spending another night out in the open was unbearable. So I pushed on, long past the point when I would normally have stopped for the day. My flashlight beam cut a meager path through the growing darkness, and still I walked, driven by a primal fear that I couldn't name or understand. It was well past midnight when exhaustion finally forced me to stop. I found a small hollow between the roots of a massive sequoia, and huddled there, too tired and frightened to even set up my tent. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept repeating in my mind: I'm not alone out here, and whatever is with me, it isn't human. I must have dozed off at some point because I awoke with a start, disoriented and groggy. The forest around me was pitch black, my flashlight having died sometime during my fitful sleep. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or why I felt so terrified. Then it all came rushing back, the tracks, the whispers, the overwhelming sense of being watched. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I became aware of a faint, sickly sweet odor permeating the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled before, a nauseating blend of rotting meat and something musky and animal-like. The stench seemed to grow stronger with each passing second, and with it came a certainty that chilled me to my core. I wasn't alone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but fear had frozen me in place. I strained my ears, listening for any sound that might betray the presence of whatever was out there. For several agonizing moments, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard, too deep and resonant to be a bear or mountain lion. The growl rose in pitch, becoming a keening wail that set my teeth on edge and sent shivers down my spine. And then I saw it. A massive shape detached itself from the darkness between two towering sequoias. At first my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was simply too large, too wrong to be real. But as it moved into a patch of moonlight, I could no longer deny the evidence of my own eyes. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall at the shoulder, moving in a hunched, loping gait that was neither fully bipedal nor quadrupedal. Its body was covered in matted dark fur, but in places I could see patches of leathery skin, mottled and diseased-looking. The limbs were grotesquely elongated, ending in massive paws tipped with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. The muzzle was too wide for any known predator, splitting almost to the creature's ears in a permanent fanged grin. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They glowed with an amber light, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly alien. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with an almost curious expression. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me. That broke the spell. With a strangled cry, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I abandoned my pack, my supplies, everything. My only thought was escape. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and arms. Behind me I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I ran blindly, with no idea of where I was going or what direction I was headed. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Somehow, miraculously, I broke through the tree line and found myself in a small meadow. In the distance I could see lights, a road, civilization, safety. But I had only made it halfway across the clearing when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scream. A woman's voice, filled with terror, cut off abruptly. It came from the same woods I had just fled. I froze, torn between self-preservation and the instinct to help. Before I could decide, 3 figures burst from the tree line, a woman and 2 men, all looking as terrified as I felt. They were shouting incoherently, casting frantic glances over their shoulders. And then I saw why. The creature exploded from the forest, moving with impossible speed. Its face was contorted in a snarl, fangs gleaming in the moonlight. It was gaining on the hikers with every bound. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was a sudden burst of courage, or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help. Whatever the reason, I found myself running back toward the tree line, waving my arms and yelling at the top of my lungs. "Hey, over here!" The creature hesitated, its massive head swiveling in my direction. Those terrible amber eyes locked onto mine once again, and for a moment I was certain I had just sealed my own doom. But the distraction had given the other hikers the head start they needed. They disappeared into the woods on the far side of the meadow, their screams fading into the distance. For what felt like an eternity, the creature and I stared at each other across the moonlit clearing. I was certain it would charge, that my foolish act of bravery would be the last thing I ever did. But to my amazement and relief, it turned away. With one last baleful glance in my direction, it loped back into the forest, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. I stood there shaking and gasping for breath, unable to believe what had just happened. Part of me wanted to follow the other hikers to make sure they were safe, but a larger part, the part driven by pure survival instinct, knew I had to get out of there immediately. So I ran. I ran until my legs gave out and my lungs felt like they would burst. I ran until the first light of dawn began to paint the sky. And when I finally stumbled out of the woods and onto a paved road, I collapsed, too exhausted and traumatized to go any further. I don't remember much of what happened immediately after I reached the road. I have vague recollections of a park ranger finding me, of being loaded into a vehicle, of trying desperately to explain what I had seen. But it all blurs together in a haze of exhaustion and lingering terror. When I finally came to my senses, I was in a small hospital room. The sterile white walls and the smell of disinfectant were a jarring contrast to the wild terror of the forest. A nurse explained that I had been found on the side of the road, dehydrated and suffering from exhaustion. I had apparently been rambling incoherently about a monster in the woods. As my mind cleared, park rangers came to interview me. I told them everything about the tracks, the whispers, and finally the creature itself. I described the other hikers I had seen, hoping against hope that they had made it to safety. But as I spoke, I could see the doubt in the rangers' eyes. They exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of concern and skepticism. "Mister, your name," one of the rangers said gently. "We understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but I need you to understand. We found no evidence of any large predator in the area you described, and there have been no reports of missing hikers." I protested, insisting that what I had seen was real. But the more I talked, the more I realized how insane it all sounded. A 7-foot-tall monster with glowing eyes, whispering forests. I began to doubt my own memories. Had the isolation and fear played tricks on my mind? The rangers assured me they would investigate further, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They likely thought I had gotten lost, panicked, and hallucinated the whole thing. Part of me wanted to believe that too. It would have been easier, safer, to think it had all been a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and dehydration. But I couldn't shake the memory of those amber eyes, the stench of the creature's breath, the sound of its growl. It had been real. I knew it in my bones. The following days were a blur of medical tests, psychological evaluations, and endless questions. My story made its way to the local news, painted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of solo hiking. Some reports suggested I had encountered a bear, and my mind had exaggerated the experience. Others hinted at drug use or mental illness. Through it all, I clung to what I knew to be true, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of my certainty. I scoured news reports and online forums, looking for any hint that others had seen something similar. There were whispers, stories of strange sightings in national parks across the country, but nothing concrete. Nothing I could point to and say, "See, I'm not crazy, it's real." Weeks passed and life slowly began to return to normal. But I was changed. The experience had left an indelible mark on my psyche. I jumped at shadows, flinched at unexpected sounds. The thought of entering a forest filled me with a primal dread I couldn't shake. And always, there was the nagging fear that somewhere out there in the deep woods of Sequoia National Park, that thing was still roaming, still hunting. Years have passed since that fateful trip, and I've done my best to move on with my life. I left my job in the city, unable to bear the claustrophobia of tall buildings and crowded streets. Now I live in a small coastal town, as far from the deep forests as I could get. The sound of waves crashing against the shore brings me a peace I thought I'd never find again. But the memories never truly fade. They come to me in dreams, vivid and terrifying. I wake in the night, drenched in sweat, the phantom scent of rotting meat in my nostrils. In these moments the doubt falls away, and I know with certainty that what I experienced was real. I've tried to research, to find some explanation for what I saw. I've delved into cryptozoology, folklore, even fringe theories about interdimensional beings. Nothing quite fits, but the search gives me purpose. I've connected with others online who claim to have had similar encounters. Some of their stories ring true, resonating with my own experience. Others seem like obvious hoaxes or delusions. I've learned to be cautious, to question everything, including my own memories. There are nights when I sit on my porch staring out at the ocean, and I wonder about those other hikers. Did they make it out safely? Do they remember what they saw? Or have they convinced themselves it was all a bad dream, a moment of panic in the woods? Sometimes I envy them that possibility of denial. I haven't set foot in a national park since that day. The thought of it sends a chill down my spine. But recently I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to go back. Not to Sequoia, I don't think I could bear that. But perhaps to another forest, another trail. Part of me thinks it's madness to even consider it. But another part, a part I'm not entirely comfortable with, wonders if I might find answers. What if I could prove it was real? What if I could find evidence that would make people believe me? Or what if I could see it again? The thought both terrifies and exhilarates me. I know it's dangerous. I know I should let sleeping dogs lie, should be grateful that I escaped with my life and my sanity mostly intact. But the experience changed me, marked me in ways I'm still trying to understand. And deep down, I know that until I face this thing, whether it's a real monster or the demons in my own mind, I'll never truly be free. So I find myself planning, preparing. I've been working out, getting back into shape. I've been studying survival techniques, not just the basics I knew before, but advanced skills. And I've been gathering equipment better than anything I had on that ill-fated trip. I tell myself it's just a precaution, that I probably won't go through with it. But as I write this account, as I relive those terrifying moments in the woods, I feel a sense of resolution settling over me. I need to know. I need to understand. Whatever's out there, be it flesh and blood or something more supernatural, I'll be ready for it this time. And maybe, just maybe, I'll finally find the answers I've been seeking all these years. To anyone reading this, if you venture into the deep woods, into those places where the silence feels alive and the shadows seem to move, be careful, be alert. And if you hear whispers on the wind or catch a glimpse of amber eyes in the darkness, run. Run, and don't look back. Because now you know there are things in this world far older and darker than we understand. And they're watching, always watching. My name is Elian, and I'm about to tell you a story that will change the way you look at the world. It's been a couple of years since it happened, but the memory is as fresh as if it were yesterday. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush still sends a chill down my spine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. I've lived on the outskirts of the Olympic National Forest my entire life. The dense, towering trees have always been a constant presence, looming just beyond my backyard. But for most of my life I barely gave them a second thought. I was what you'd call a homebody, more comfortable with the glow of a computer screen than the dappled sunlight filtering through a forest canopy. My days followed a predictable routine. Wake up, work from home as a software developer, maybe order some takeout, then lose myself in online gaming or binge-watching shows until the early hours of the morning. Weekends weren't much different, just with longer gaming sessions and the occasional trip to the grocery store. Social interaction? That was limited to online chats and the brief, awkward small talk with delivery drivers. I told myself I was content with this lifestyle, After all, I had everything I needed at my fingertips. Why venture out into the messy, unpredictable world when I could control every aspect of my environment from the comfort of my home? But as the months turned into years, a gnawing emptiness began to grow inside me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a vague sense of unease, a feeling that something was missing. I tried to ignore it, drowning it out with louder music, more intense games, anything to keep my mind occupied. It was during one of my late-night internet deep dives that I stumbled across a local forum. People were sharing their experiences hiking in the Olympic National Forest, posting breathtaking photos of misty valleys and snow-capped peaks. As I scrolled through the images, something stirred within me. A long-forgotten memory of a childhood hike with my parents bubbled to the surface. I remembered the crisp air, the earthy smell of the forest floor, the sense of adventure as we explored hidden trails. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I made a decision. It was time for a change. I needed to break out of my self-imposed isolation, to reconnect with the world beyond my four walls. And what better way to do that than by exploring the vast wilderness that had been my silent neighbor for so long? The next morning I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I dug out an old backpack from the depths of my closet and started researching hiking essentials. Water bottle, check. Trail mix, check. First aid kit, check. I even invested in a decent pair of hiking boots, wincing slightly at the price but reminding myself that this was an investment in my well-being. As I prepared for my first hike, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. The forest that had been a mere backdrop to my life for so long was about to become my playground. Little did I know that it would soon become something else entirely, a place of terror, mystery, and life-altering encounters. If only I had known what awaited me in those woods. Would I have still ventured out that fateful morning? It's a question I've asked myself countless times since. But as I stand here now, a changed man with a story that few would believe, I can't help but think that some forces are beyond our control. Some destinies, no matter how incredible or terrifying, are meant to be fulfilled. So, let me take you back to that summer morning when a sheltered computer geek decided to step out of his comfort zone and into a world he was woefully unprepared for. A world where ancient legends walk on two legs, where the line between myth and reality blurs, and where the price of knowledge is paid in sleepless nights and constant vigilance. This is my story. The story of how I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and how that encounter transformed me from a recluse into a warrior who now stands guard at the edge of two worlds, forever watchful, forever changed. The morning of my hike dawned crisp and clear, a perfect day for a new adventure. I remember standing at the edge of my property, backpack slung over my shoulders, staring into the tree line. The forest seemed to breathe, a living entity calling out to me. With a deep breath, I took my first steps onto the trail. The initial part of the hike was everything I had hoped for. Sunlight dappled the forest floor, creating a mesmerizing dance of light and shadow. Birds I couldn't name filled the air with their songs, a natural symphony so different from the artificial sounds I was used to. The earthy scent of decaying leaves and fresh growth filled my nostrils, awakening senses long dulled by recycled air and the glow of screens. As I walked, I felt the tension in my body begin to unwind. My steps, at first hesitant and awkward, found a natural rhythm. I began to notice the little things, the intricate patterns of lichen on tree bark, the delicate unfurling of fern fronds, the scurrying of small creatures in the underbrush. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The trail I had chosen was supposed to be an easy one, perfect for beginners. It wound through old-growth forest, promising stunning views of the Olympic Mountains in the distance. As I hiked, I found myself wondering why I had waited so long to experience this. The beauty around me was overwhelming, and I felt a deep sense of connection to the natural world that I had been missing for so long. About 2 hours into my hike, I decided to take a break. I found a fallen log off to the side of the trail and sat down, pulling out my water bottle and a granola bar. As I sat there, savoring the quiet and the gentle breeze on my face, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone silent. It happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice at first, but as I sat there, the absence of birdsong and rustling leaves became deafening. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the day. That's when I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 50 yards down the trail, partially obscured by a large fir tree, was what looked like a pile of bones. Bleached white by the sun, they stood out starkly against the deep greens and browns of the forest floor. My curiosity overrode my initial unease. I stood up, shouldered my backpack, and cautiously made my way towards the bones. As I got closer, I could see that they were being picked over by a few crows, their black feathers a stark contrast to the white bones. But something was off. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The skull, partially visible beneath the other bones, was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was elongated with a massive jaw that seemed far too big for any animal I knew of in these woods, and the scatter pattern of the bones was all wrong. They were spread out over an unnaturally wide area, as if something enormous had been torn apart. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of branches snapping, coming from deeper in the trees to my right. My heart began to race. I called out, hoping against hope that it was just another hiker playing a prank. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and afraid, even to my own ears. There was no response, just another crack, closer this time. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was moving towards me. Bear, I thought. It has to be a bear. But even as the thought formed, I knew it wasn't true. Bears don't move like that, with such deliberate, almost stealthy movements. This was something else entirely. I began to back away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had heard the noise. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, as if every living thing was aware of the predator in their midst. And then it stepped out of the shadows. In that moment my world shattered. Everything I thought I knew about reality, about what was possible in this world, crumbled in the face of the creature before me. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its body a nightmarish blend of wolf and man. Thick matted fur covered its massive frame, muscles rippling beneath as it moved. But it was the face that truly froze the blood in my veins. A wolf's muzzle, elongated and filled with yellowed fangs, but with eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. Those eyes fixed on me, filled with a predatory calculation that was all too human. My mind reeled, grasping for any explanation, any rationalization for what I was seeing. But there was only one word that fit, a word I had dismissed as fiction and folklore: dogman. As the creature took a step towards me, a primal instinct kicked in. Run! I turned and bolted down the trail, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind me I heard a snarl that seemed to shake the very air, followed by the sound of pursuit. The creature moved with impossible speed, easily navigating the undergrowth that I stumbled through. Blind panic propelled me forward. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that monster as possible. But with each passing second, I could hear it gaining on me. Its ragged breathing became a monstrous drumbeat in my ears, growing louder with each bound. In my terror, I lost my footing. The world spun around me as I tumbled down a steep slope, my body bouncing off rocks and tree trunks. Pain exploded in my side as I slammed into a large tree, knocking the wind out of me. I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath, certain that this was the end. I could hear the creature approaching, its heavy footfalls drawing nearer. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But then something unexpected happened. Screams echoed through the forest, human screams. They were coming from further down the trail, where it widened into a more popular hiking area. The creature hesitated. I cracked my eyes open, watching as it turned its massive head towards the sound. For a moment it stood there, caught between its current prey, me, and the potential of more victims. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it melted back into the trees. The only evidence of its presence was the sway of branches, and a lingering musky odor that burned my nostrils. Adrenaline surged through me once more. Despite the pain in my side, I scrambled to my feet and half ran, half stumbled towards the screams. As I burst out onto the wider trail, I came face to face with a group of hikers, their faces pale with terror. "What happened?" I gasped, scanning the trees around us for any sign of the creature. One of the hikers, a middle-aged man with a shock of gray hair, turned to me with wild eyes. It took Jim," he stammered. We were just walking, and this thing came out of nowhere. It grabbed Jim and dragged him into the woods. It happened so fast. The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about me anymore. Someone had been taken, possibly killed by that monster. And I was the only one who had seen it clearly. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. By some miracle, I had a signal. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I reported what had happened. The dispatcher's skepticism was clear, but she assured me that park rangers and local police would be dispatched immediately. As we waited for help to arrive, I found myself scanning the tree line constantly, every muscle in my body tense. The other hikers huddled together, whispering and occasionally breaking into sobs. I wanted to comfort them, to tell them that everything would be okay. But how could I, when I knew the truth of what was out there? When the authorities finally arrived, their faces were grim but skeptical. They took our statements, their pens scratching against notepads as we recounted our experiences. I could see the disbelief in their eyes as I described the creature in detail. To them, it was likely just the ramblings of a scared, inexperienced hiker who had let his imagination run wild. They organized a search party for the missing hiker, Jim. I wanted to warn them, to tell them what they were really up against. But the words stuck in my throat. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, the search was called off. No sign of Jim had been found, no trace of the creature I had seen. The official report would later list it as a probable animal attack, perhaps a bear or mountain lion. But I knew the truth. And so did the other hikers, even if they couldn't fully articulate what they had seen. As we were escorted back to the trailhead, I could see it in their eyes, the same haunted look that I knew must be in mine. That night, as I lay in my bed, every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window made me jump. Sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the events of the day in vivid detail. The elongated skull among the bones, the yellow eyes of the creature, the terror and the voices of the other hikers. It all swirled together in a nightmarish collage. As the first light of dawn crept through my window, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my old life, couldn't pretend that the world was the same as it had been yesterday. Something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation, and I needed to understand it. Little did I know that this decision would set me on a path that would consume my life, transforming me from a reclusive computer geek into something else entirely. A sentinel, a guardian standing watch at the edge of a world most people would never know existed. The forest had awakened something in me that day, not just fear, but a burning need to know, to understand. And in the years that followed, that need would drive me to places I never imagined I'd go, and to face terrors beyond my wildest nightmares. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, let me tell you about the days that followed my encounter, and how a town's whispered secrets began to unravel before my eyes. The days following my encounter in the forest passed in a blur of police interviews, sleepless nights, and a growing sense of isolation. The official story was that Jim, the missing hiker, had likely been the victim of a bear attack. Search parties combed the area for days but found no trace of him or the supposed bear. I knew better. The image of that creature, too tall, too intelligent to be a mere animal, was seared into my memory. But every time I tried to explain what I had seen, I was met with skeptical looks and not so subtle suggestions that perhaps the stress of the situation had affected my perception. Even my few acquaintances, people I occasionally gamed with online, seemed to distance themselves when I tried to talk about it. Their messages became shorter, less frequent, until they stopped altogether. I was alone with my truth, and it was slowly driving me mad. It was about a week after the incident that I finally ventured into town for supplies. As I walked down the main street, I could feel eyes on me. Whispers followed in my wake. I caught snippets of conversations. That's him. Saw something in the woods. Talking crazy about some monster. I kept my head down, trying to ignore the stares and hushed voices. But as I was loading groceries into my car, an old man approached me. His weather-beaten face was creased with wrinkles, his eyes sharp despite his advanced age. "You're the one, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The one who saw it?" I tensed, ready for another round of skepticism or mockery. But something in his tone made me pause. "Saw what?" I asked cautiously. He glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned in closer. "The dog man," he whispered. "You're not the first, you know, and you won't be the last." My heart began to race. Here, finally, was someone who didn't think I was crazy. You believe me?" The old man nodded solemnly. "Come with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't a conversation for open streets." I hesitated for a moment, my ingrained caution warring with my desperate need for answers. In the end, curiosity won out. I followed the old man down a series of winding alleys until we reached a small, nondescript building tucked away behind the town's main square. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Frontier Curiosities and Antiques." The old man unlocked the door and ushered me inside. The shop was cluttered with an eclectic mix of items: old furniture, dusty books, and glass cases filled with what looked like Native American artifacts. "Name's Gerald," the old man said as he flipped the open sign to closed. "I've run this shop for longer than most folks in this town have been alive, and in all that time I've heard stories most people dismiss as tall tales or drunken ramblings, but I know better." He disappeared behind a beaded curtain and returned moments later with 2 steaming mugs of tea. As he handed me one, I noticed his hands were gnarled with age but steady. "What you saw out there," he continued, "it's been haunting these woods for generations. The locals, those who've been here long enough to know, they call it the Olympic Phantom." I took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through my body, grounding me as Gerald spoke of things that shook the foundations of my reality. "The native tribes had legends of shapeshifters and spirit walkers," he said, gesturing to some of the artifacts in his shop. "When the first European settlers came, they brought their own folklore, tales of werewolves and other beasts. What if they were all talking about the same thing?" I listened, rapt, as Gerald spun a tale that stretched back centuries. He spoke of periodic disappearances in the forest, of mangled bodies found with wounds no known animal could inflict, of shadowy figures seen at the edge of firelight. "But why?" I finally interrupted. "Why doesn't everyone know about this? Why isn't it front-page news?" Gerald's eyes grew sad. "Fear," he said simply. "Fear and willful ignorance. It's easier to blame bears or mountain lions, to dismiss sightings as imagination or hoaxes. The alternative, well, it would change everything, wouldn't it? How we see the world, our place in it." He was right, I realized. My own encounter had already changed me profoundly, if everyone knew the truth. "There's more," Gerald continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Over the years I've connected with others who've had similar experiences. We share information, keep an eye out for patterns, and lately something's changed." "Changed how?" I asked, leaning forward. "The sightings are becoming more frequent, and the creature, or creatures, we're not sure. They're getting bolder. Your encounter? That's the closest it's come to town in living memory." A chill ran down my spine as the implications sank in. "What can we do?" I whispered. Gerald fixed me with a penetrating stare. "That, young man, is the question. Some of us, we've taken it upon ourselves to be watchers, to guard the boundary between our world and theirs. It's a lonely path, full of danger and doubt, but someone has to do it." In that moment I felt something shift inside me. The fear and confusion that had plagued me since my encounter began to crystallize into something else, a sense of purpose. "I want to help," I heard myself say. "I need to understand what's out there." Gerald nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "I thought you might, but be warned. Once you step fully into this world, there's no going back. Your life will never be the same." As I left Gerald's shop that day, my head spinning with newfound knowledge and purpose, I knew I stood at a crossroads. I could try to forget what I'd seen, to slip back into my old comfortable life, or I could embrace this new reality, with all its terrors and mysteries. The choice in the end wasn't really a choice at all. The forest had awakened something in me, a primal need to protect, to stand guard against the encroaching darkness. As I drove home, my resolve hardened. I would become a watcher, a sentinel against the unknown. Little did I know just how much this decision would test me, body and soul, in the months and years to come. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as I threw myself into my new role as a watcher. Gerald introduced me to a loose network of like-minded individuals, a retired park ranger, a local librarian with a penchant for cryptozoology, a wildlife photographer who'd captured more than she'd bargained for on film. Each had their own encounter story, their own reasons for dedicating themselves to this secret vigil. I devoured every scrap of information they could provide. Old newspaper clippings detailing mysterious disappearances, grainy photographs of shadowy figures, hand-drawn maps marking sighting locations. I pored over it all, looking for patterns, for anything that might help me understand what we were up against. But knowledge, I quickly learned, wasn't enough. If I was going to venture back into those woods, and I knew I had to, I needed to be prepared. I threw myself into physical training with a fervor that surprised me. Early morning runs to build stamina, weight training to increase strength, even basic self-defense classes. I was no longer the soft, sedentary computer geek I'd been just months ago. I also invested in equipment, high-powered flashlights, night vision goggles, top-of-the-line camping gear. And after much internal debate and a frank discussion with Gerald, I acquired a firearm and learned how to use it. The thought of carrying a weapon made me uneasy, but the memory of those yellow eyes and gleaming fangs steeled my resolve. I hoped I'd never have to use it, but I wouldn't be caught defenseless again. As summer faded into fall, I began to accompany other watchers on their patrols. We'd hike deep into the forest, always alert, always watching. Most nights passed uneventfully, but there were moments that made my hair stand on end. Unexplained noises in the darkness, fleeting shadows just at the edge of vision, the oppressive feeling of being watched. It was on one of these patrols, as the first winter snows began to dust the forest floor, that I had my second encounter. I was with Mara, the wildlife photographer, scouting a series of caves where there had been recent reports of strange activity. The day was overcast, a steely gray sky visible through the bare branches overhead. As we approached the cave system, an unnatural silence fell over the woods. Mara and I exchanged a glance. We'd both been doing this long enough to know that silence in the forest was never a good sign. Slowly, carefully, we drew our weapons and switched on our flashlights. The beam of my light swept across the cave entrance, revealing nothing but bare rock and shadows. But as I took a step closer, a gust of wind brought a familiar scent. That same musky odor I'd smelled on the day of my first encounter. "Mara," I whispered, my voice tight with tension. "Do you smell that?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. "It's here," she breathed. As if in response to her words, a low growl emanated from the depths of the cave. It was a sound that vibrated in my chest, primal and terrifying. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground, my flashlight beam steady on the cave mouth. And then it emerged. It was both familiar and different from the creature I'd seen before. The basic shape was the same, the elongated wolf-like head, the massive muscular body covered in thick fur. But this one was larger, its fur streaked with gray, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They weren't just predatory, they held an ancient alien intelligence that froze me to my core. For a long moment we stood there, human and monster, locked in a silent standoff. I could hear Mara's ragged breathing beside me, could feel my own heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed fangs as long as my fingers. It took a step forward, its massive paws leaving imprints in the light snow. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. I remember the deafening report of Mara's rifle, the acrid smell of gunpowder. I remember the creature's roar of pain and fury as the bullet found its mark. And I remember running, faster than I'd ever run in my life, the sound of pursuit fading behind us as we crashed through the underbrush. We didn't stop running until we reached our vehicle, and we didn't speak until we were miles away from that cave. When we finally pulled over, our hands shaking too badly to drive any further, Mara turned to me with wide eyes. "You saw it, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Tell me you saw it too." I nodded, unable to find words. We sat there in silence for a long time, processing what we'd just experienced. It was Mara who finally broke the silence. "It's escalating," she said softly. "They're getting bolder, coming closer to populated areas. We need to warn the others." I knew she was right, but a part of me recoiled at the thought of reliving that encounter, of admitting how close we'd come to, what? Death? Something worse? But I also knew we had a responsibility. We were watchers, sentinels against the darkness. If we didn't stand guard, who would? As we drove back to town, a grim determination settled over me. The encounter had shaken me to my core, yes, but it had also strengthened my resolve. I was no longer just seeking answers or chasing shadows. I was fighting a war, a secret war that most of the world didn't even know was happening. The coming months would test me in ways I never imagined. There would be more encounters, each more harrowing than the last. There would be losses, good people who ventured into the dark and never returned. But there would also be victories, small but significant, as we pushed back against the encroaching darkness. Through it all, I would remember that moment in the snowy forest, staring into the eyes of something that should not exist. It was the moment I truly understood what it meant to be a watcher. Not just a seeker of truth, but a guardian of a world that slept unknowing while ancient terrors stalked the shadows. The path ahead would be long and fraught with danger. But as I looked out at the forest passing by outside the car window, I knew there was no turning back. This was my purpose now, my calling. The watcher's path lay before me, and I would walk it to whatever end awaited. As winter deepened, casting the Olympic National Forest in a blanket of white, our network of watchers grew increasingly concerned. Reports were coming in from all over the region. Livestock mutilations, strange tracks found in remote areas, and most alarmingly, a spike in missing persons cases. Gerald called an emergency meeting at his shop. As I entered the familiar cluttered space, I was struck by the tension in the air. Faces that had become familiar to me over the past months were drawn and worried. Mara sat in a corner, her usual vibrant energy subdued. Next to her was Tom, the ex-park ranger, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Folks," Gerald began once we were all settled, "I think we can all agree that something big is coming. These creatures, whatever they are growing more active, more aggressive. We need to decide on a course of action." What followed was hours of heated debate. Some, like Tom, argued for a more proactive approach, actively hunting the creatures, trying to thin their numbers. Others, including Mara, advocated for focusing on protection and awareness, warning hikers, setting up surveillance in high-risk areas. I listened to it all, my mind racing. Both approaches had merit, but also significant risks. Going on the offensive could provoke retaliation we weren't prepared for. But staying purely defensive might allow the situation to spiral out of control. As the argument reached a fever pitch, I found myself standing up. All eyes turned to me, and I took a deep breath. "What if we're thinking about this all wrong?" I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "We've been reacting, always one step behind. But what if we could predict their movements, understand their patterns?" A hush fell over the room as I explained my idea. Using my background in software development, I proposed creating a database and mapping system. We'd input all known sightings, attacks, and anomalies, looking for correlations with factors like weather patterns, lunar cycles, and human activity in the area. If we can understand their behavior, I concluded, we might be able to anticipate their actions. We could be proactive without being provocative. There was a moment of silence, then Gerald nodded slowly. "It's a start," he said. "Not a complete solution, but a foundation we can build on." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the project. My small home office transformed into a command center of sorts, walls covered in maps and charts, my computer humming as it processed vast amounts of data. Patterns began to emerge. The creatures seemed more active during the new moon, when the nights were darkest. They appeared to have territorial boundaries, but these were slowly expanding. And there was a clear correlation between human encroachment into remote areas and increased creature activity. As winter began to thaw into spring, we put our new knowledge to the test. Using the predictive model I'd developed, we concentrated our patrols in areas of likely activity. It wasn't perfect. The creatures were too intelligent, too unpredictable to be reduced to mere data points. But it gave us an edge we desperately needed. Our first major victory came in late March. The model predicted increased activity near an old abandoned mining town deep in the forest. Tom, Mara, and I set up a stakeout, spending cold, tense nights watching and waiting. On the third night, as a misty rain fell from a moonless sky, we saw them. 3 creatures moving with that unnatural blend of animal grace and human-like purpose. They were headed towards a campsite about a mile away, a campsite we knew was occupied by a group of college students on a spring break hiking trip. What followed was the most harrowing night of my life. We shadowed the creatures, using every trick we'd learned to remain undetected. When they were far enough from the campsite, we sprang our trap. Floodlights, noisemakers, and a barrage of warning shots. The chaos that erupted is burned into my memory. The creatures' howls of rage and confusion, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the heart-stopping moments when it seemed our plan had only enraged them further. But in the end, our preparations paid off. The creatures retreated, melting into the shadows of the forest. As dawn broke, we stood there, exhausted but exhilarated. We had done it. We had predicted their movements and prevented an attack. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it proved that our approach could work. But our elation was short-lived. As we hiked back to our vehicle, Mara's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call. The news hit us like a physical blow. While we were occupied with our stakeout, another attack had occurred on the other side of the forest. A family of 4 found torn apart in their remote cabin. The ride back to town was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We had won a battle, yes, but the war was far from over, and the stakes, we were learning, were higher than we had ever imagined. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I found myself questioning everything. Were we really making a difference, or just delaying the inevitable? Could a handful of watchers really hope to stand against something so ancient, so powerful? But then I remembered the campsite full of unknowing students, alive and safe because of our actions. I thought of all the people living their lives in blissful ignorance of the dangers lurking in the shadows, and I knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that we had to keep fighting. The coming months would bring more challenges, more hard decisions and losses that would shake us to our core. But that night, as the first light of dawn crept through my window, I made a silent vow. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, I would continue to walk the Watcher's path. For in that moment, I understood a fundamental truth. The greatest monsters are not those that lurk in the dark, but those that arise when good people choose to look away. Little did I know that my resolve would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined, as the conflict between our world and theirs escalated to a fever pitch. Summer arrived with an oppressive heat that seemed to hang over the Olympic National Forest like a shroud. Our network of watchers was stretched thin, responding to an unprecedented surge in sightings and incidents. The predictive model I'd developed was proving invaluable, but we were all running on fumes, caught in a relentless cycle of patrols, investigations, and increasingly dangerous confrontations. It was on a sweltering night in late July that everything changed. I was out on a solo patrol, checking on a series of motion-activated cameras we'd set up along one of the creature's known travel routes. The forest was unnaturally still, the usual symphony of nocturnal life muted as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. As I approached the third camera in our array, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. The camera, which should have been securely fastened to a tree, was lying on the ground, its casing cracked open like an egg. I crouched down to examine it, my heart pounding in my chest. The memory card was missing. This wasn't the random destruction of an animal. This was deliberate. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my hand flying to the holster at my hip, but I was too slow. A massive shape hurtled out of the darkness, slamming into me with the force of a freight train. I hit the ground hard, the air driven from my lungs. Gasping, I found myself staring up into a face from my nightmares. It was one of them, larger than any I'd seen before. Its yellow eyes gleamed with a terrifying intelligence as it pinned me to the forest floor. This was it, I thought. After all the close calls, all the narrow escapes, this was how it would end. I closed my eyes, bracing for the killing blow. But it didn't come. Instead, a low rumbling sound filled the air. It took me a moment to realize what I was hearing. Words. The creature was speaking. "Why do you interfere?" The shock of hearing intelligible speech from this monster paralyzed me more effectively than any physical restraint. My mind reeled, struggling to process this paradigm-shifting development. "You are a prey," the creature continued, each word seeming to cause it physical effort. "Yet you fight. Why?" In that moment, faced with the very embodiment of my fears, I found a well of courage I didn't know I possessed. "We fight because we must," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Because there are those who can't fight for themselves. Because this is our home too." The creature's grip on me loosened slightly, its head tilting in what looked unsettlingly like curiosity. "Home," it repeated as if testing the word. "We were here first, long before your kind." What followed was the most surreal conversation of my life. There on the forest floor, I learned fragments of a history older than human civilization. The creature spoke of a time when their kind roamed freely, of a gradual retreat into the shadows as humans spread across the land. They had watched us grow, evolve, multiply, and now as our cities expanded and our technology advanced, they felt the last of their wild domains slipping away. "We fight to survive," the creature growled, "as do you." As dawn began to paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, the creature released me and melted back into the forest. I lay there for a long time, my mind struggling to process what had just occurred. When I finally made it back to town and shared my experience, it was met with disbelief, anger, and fear. Some accused me of losing my mind, others of making up stories. But a few, Gerald, Mara, and a handful of others, saw the profound implications of this encounter. If these creatures were not just animals, but sentient beings, capable of communication and complex thought, it changed everything. Our entire approach, our understanding of the situation, had to be reevaluated. The weeks that followed were tumultuous. Our network of watchers fractured, with some refusing to accept the new reality, and others pushing for attempts at further communication. I found myself at the center of a storm of controversy, my every word and action scrutinized. But amidst the chaos, a new path began to emerge. If we could establish some form of dialogue, perhaps we could find a way to coexist. It wouldn't be easy. Centuries of fear and conflict had left deep scars on both sides. But it was a chance, however slim, to end the cycle of violence. As summer faded into autumn, we made our first tentative steps toward peace. Using our predictive model, we identified likely meeting spots and left messages, simple symbols and offerings that we hoped would be understood as gestures of goodwill. Progress was slow and fraught with setbacks. For every small breakthrough, there were incidents that threatened to plunge us back into open conflict. Trust was in short supply on both sides. But gradually, painstakingly, we began to build bridges. We learned more of their history, their culture, their ways of thinking. In return, we tried to help them understand us, our fears, our hopes, our reasons for pushing ever deeper into the wild places. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still those on both sides who preferred conflict to compromise. Incidents still occurred, and lives were still lost. But slowly the tide began to turn. As I stand here now, looking out over the forest that has been my battleground and my classroom these past years, I'm filled with a complex mix of emotions. Pride in how far we've come, sorrow for the losses along the way, hope for the future we're building, tentative though it may be. The path of a watcher has changed. We're no longer just guardians against the dark, but bridge builders between two worlds. It's a role that comes with its own set of challenges and dangers, but also incredible possibilities. I think back to that day, years ago, when I first stepped onto the forest trail, a sheltered computer geek looking for a bit of fresh air. I could never have imagined the journey that lay ahead of me, the terrors I would face, the wonders I would witness, the profound ways in which I would be changed. As the sun sets over the Olympic National Forest, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, I feel a familiar presence. Just at the edge of the tree line, a pair of yellow eyes meets mine. There's still wariness there, still a gulf of difference between us. But there's something else too, a glimmer of understanding, of shared purpose. I nod in acknowledgement, and the eyes blink once before disappearing into the gathering darkness. I turn back toward town, ready for another night of vigilance, of building tenuous trust, of standing guard at the border between two worlds. The Watcher's path stretches out before me, no longer a lonely road, but a bridge between realities. And though the journey is far from over, I walk it with a lighter heart, knowing that every step brings us closer to a future where the shadows hold not just terror, but the promise of newfound understanding. As I make my way home, the forest whispers its ancient secrets behind me, and for the first time in years, I feel not fear, but a profound sense of hope. For in the end, it is not our differences that define us, but our capacity to reach across them, to find common ground in the most unlikely of places. The watch continues, but its purpose has evolved. And in that evolution lies the potential for a new chapter in the long, complex history of humans, and the mysteries that dwell in the wild places of the world.